Welcome viewers. In today's lecture series, we will study about the topic entitled Migration due to climate change in the global perspective. For that, firstly, we will go through the objective of the lecture series, which are as follows. Firstly, to understand migration occurring as a result of environmental changes. Secondly, to study the effects of migration on the population. And thirdly, to analyze the climatic changes causing migration. Now, worldwide urbanization has radically changed and continues to change the human habitat, associated with what were once highly specific lifestyles, such as high everyday mobility necessitated by urban sprawl. Urbanization has had a profound effect on the relationship between population and environment, not least because of the amount of energy and space that is consumed as a result. This urbanization can, in turn, be seen as the outcome of a lengthy historical process starting with the shift away from hunter-gatherer societies to organized farming in prehistoric times, which radically altered the way humans considered their environment. It continued with rural exodus, which distanced humankind from the natural world. Finally, the technical and economic advances that took place over the previous 2 centuries and were especially far-reaching in certain countries profoundly modified the modes of production and consumption, creating a brand new living environment for the human beings. Since the mid-20th century, demographic, economic, and technological changes have been utterly transforming the environment, which includes deforestation, pollution, etc., making some populations more vulnerable by exposing them to real, but sometimes poorly understood, threats to their survival. These environmental transformations, some of which are only just beginning, can take any number of forms, ranging from extreme events such as earthquakes and tsunamis to gradual trends such as global warming, which is responsible for the slow rise in sea level. Some are reversible, others are not. Floods, for instance, are natural disasters that can be partly reversed despite all the damage and destruction that may have braked. Droughts may be less reversible, while nuclear accidents are totally irreversible on human timescale. Now, migration or population displacement can be driven by climatic hazards such as droughts, which are hydrologic, and storms, which are atmospheric, and geophysical hazards such as earthquake, volcanic eruptions, and tsunami. The interactions between natural hazard events and social, political, and human factors frequently act to intensify the negative effects of climatic and geophysical hazards, leading to a political and social unrest, increased social vulnerability, and human suffering. As a consequence of these adverse effects, people migrate from their native land, causing stress, uncertainty, and loss of lives and properties. However, such migration can also have positive impact on migrant lives. For example, migrants may be able to diversify their livelihood and have greater access to education or healthcare. Now, in 2020, 30.7 million people from 149 countries and territories were displaced due to different natural disasters. Among them, climatic disasters were solely responsible for displacing 30 million people within their own country, with the highest recorded displacement occurring in 2010 when 38.3 million people were displaced. Now, it is difficult to estimate the actual number of people that moved due to the impacts of climate change because people's migration decisions are triggered by a range of contextual factors. Nevertheless, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centers states that approximately 283.4 million people were displaced internally between the year 2008 and 2020 because of climatic disasters across the globe. This number represents almost 89% of the total disaster-induced displacement that occurred during this time frame. Now, whether migration is classified as political, which includes international refugees but also the state-imposed displacement of population within national borders, economic, which includes the living standards in agricultural areas, prospect of earning higher wages in the city, or environmental, which includes temporary deterioration in local condition such that life is no longer possible there. It can nonetheless be analyzed as a response to environmental changes if environment is taken not just in the narrowest physical definition but in its broader economic and social meaning. Recent studies have shown that climate change has been one of the contributing factors for the unleashing of armed conflicts, such as the recent one in Syria. Climate change caused this country to suffer a major drought during the period 2007 to 2010, leading to a series of crop failure and the consequent displacement of millions of people from rural areas to cities, resulting in overcrowding, unemployment, and major political unrest that eventually led to a civil war. Migratory movements as a consequence of environmental causes have been studied in the past. However, it has only been in recent decades that the international scientific and political community has taken a special interest in identifying and assessing the link between both variables, even to the extent that the International Organization for Migration has proposed a definition for people who are forced to migrate due to climate-related changes of environmental consequences. So-called environmental migrants are people or groups of people who, due to a sudden or progressive change in the environment that adversely affects their lives, are forced to leave their habitual homes either temporarily or permanently, and who moves either within their country or abroad. Now, since we have covered the basic points, let us come to the first quiz. Population affected by migration in 2020. The options are 30.7 million, 20.5 million, 30.9 million, and 20.7 million. And the correct answer is 30.7 million. Geographical mobility as a response to environmental changes. Now, a classic but nonetheless important question in what we can call environmental demography can be expressed as follows. Is migration a cause or a consequence of environmental change? It goes without saying that the answer is both, as we are dealing here with a system of interactions. Climate migration has multifaceted impacts on people's livelihoods. Being displaced from their home, people migrate within their own country, described as internal migration, or across borders to other countries, which are known as international migration. Now, internal movement of climate migrants occur mostly to the nearby major cities or larger urban centers. Climate migrants who tries to move internationally are significantly challenged by two different security problems. Firstly, they cannot live in their own homeland because of the worsening climatic impacts and are forced to leave their ancestral land. Secondly, they cannot move to other countries quickly to find a safer place because, according to the international law, climate migrants are not refugees and they are not supported by the UN Refugee Convention or any international formal protection policies. Now, next, we come to the Hurricane Katrina. The relationship between migration and environment can vary quite considerably. For instance, the impact of a natural disaster may be very different depending on whether it occurs in a developed or a developing country. And when Hurricane Katrina struck a wealthy country, it disproportionately affected the poorest members of the society. The consequences of the 2005 disaster are often expressed in terms of the numbers of dead and injured. But we also need to look at the number of people who moved out of the vulnerable areas during the evacuation phase before the hurricane struck. The extent and intensity of the emigration triggered by the disaster itself, and the timeline for return migration. In New Orleans, the city most badly affected by Katrina, 80% of the 480,000 residents were evacuated, and it is estimated that 1 million people fled the whole of the New Orleans area. The destruction of people's homes and places of work meant that the population was slow to return. 1 year after the hurricane, the city's population was less than half of what it had been. The intensity of this return migration to New Orleans varied according to whether the population was black or white, rich or poor. These differing rates of return for different groups can partly be explained by the fact that historical disparities in the city's socio-economic structure was reflected in the spatial segregation. Put simply, the black population had been concentrated in the most low-lying areas of the city, which were obviously most vulnerable to flooding. As their homes were thus more severely damaged, they were slower to return to the city. Next, we come to the environmental migrants in Africa. We will now broaden our discussion to environmental migrants in general. This term refers to individuals who are forced to leave the place where they live because an environmental change, be it sudden or more gradual, has made living there too difficult or quite simply impossible. Their departure may be either temporary or permanent. It is obviously easier to identify international migrants when the change is catastrophic, that is, a natural disaster has occurred, than when it is more gradual. In the case of the latter, population leave as and when living conditions become too difficult, but some may have a higher poverty threshold than others, and the decision to leave is thus an individual or family matter. In short, the effects of change are not purely mechanical. The trend towards desertification is one of the causes of migration. People are forced to abandon their land because crops can no longer grow and cattle can no longer survive. Episodes of drought may intensify the existing population movements, as was the case in the Horn of Africa in 2011, with families moving from Ethiopia and Somalia to neighboring Kenya, a country also in the throes of drought, which explains why these climate refugees were so unwelcome there. A report by the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP 2011, on livelihood security discusses the links between climate change, migration, and conflict in Sahel. Changes in the environment are looked at via a series of climate indicators. We learned that between 1970 and 2006, temperature has increased by an average of 1 degree centigrade in the 9-member countries of the Permanent Interstate Committee for Drought Control in Sahel, which includes 4 coastal states, namely Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, and Senegal. 4 landlocked countries, including Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Chad, and 1 island state, which was Cape Verde. However, while the mean rise is in the order of 1 degree centigrade, there have been regional increases of as much as 1.5 degrees centigrade, if not more. Although there has been an overall increase in rainfall, patterns appear to be more erratic, potentially threatening the food security. Example, an intense rainfall can cause soil erosion. Indeed, this region has already suffered flooding, resulting not just in the loss of life, but also in population movement. The floods in Burkina Faso in 2009 and in southern Benin in 2010 forced hundreds of thousands of people to leave their homes, and a combination of floods and droughts in the region has reduced the agricultural yield and available stocks, thus lowering the local people's income. The inhabitants of some of the coastal areas would be highly vulnerable where the sea level rises significantly. Some scientists have calculated that a 1 meter rise in the sea level would affect 3 million people. Large cities would be affected, including Lagos, more than 10 million inhabitants, Abidjan, which has more than 4 million inhabitants, Dakar, nearly 3 million, Accra, Conakry, and Lome. It should be noted that although migration may sometimes be deemed to be political, insofar as political events are the cause of departure, it can be extremely wide-ranging consequences, not least for the environment. This is what happened when the return migration to Burkina Faso took place. The considerable hostility encountered by the Burkina migrants in the late 1990s and early 2000 led a great many of them to return home. They mostly settled in the southwest of the country, greatly increasing the land pressure there and triggering conflict with the local farmers. Next, we come to the vulnerability to the climate change. Climate change is expected to result in increased intensity and fluency of natural disasters, a deterioration in the living condition of populations living in fragile areas, development of diseases linked to changes in the ecosystem, unpredictable climate-threatening food security, and diminishing water resources, a rise in sea level, and ever fiercer competition for ever scarcer resources, factor for tension and conflict between populations. It is hard to predict the exact size of the population movement that will be induced by the effects of global warming, especially as it will depend on the ability of the population to react to the changes. The fact remains that the whole of the planet will be concerned even if some regions are more exposed than others. Example, very densely populated river deltas in the Southeast Asia. Next, we come to climate change in Bangladesh. Now, the information contained in the Global Emergency Disaster Database points to an increase in the number of disasters recorded over the past 30 years and a rise in the number of people affected, with a mean annual figure of 255 million between 1994 and 2003, despite the falling death tolls. Furthermore, 98% of the people affected by a natural disaster in the period 2000 to 2004 lived in the developing countries. According to a recent study by the International Organization for Migration in 2010, in Bangladesh, one of the countries where climate change is expected to have the greatest impact, more than 50 million people suffer deep poverty, and a large proportion of them live in particularly fragile areas. The coastal region of Bangladesh is especially vulnerable to sudden catastrophic events such as floods and cyclones. Climate change can but increase the risk to which people are exposed. Other effects include coastal erosion, leading to land loss and soil salinization due to the rising sea level. In these conditions, migration can be regarded as the consequence of being unable to continue living in the same place, but also a means of adapting to a very fluid environment. Example in Bangladesh, while some low-lying areas disappear beneath the waters, others are created by sediment deposit. The IOM regards migration as a safety net in the event of a natural disaster, with the inhabitants of the affected area leaving it for a more or less lengthy period. Migration induced by environmental change is likely to be internal rather than international and may fuel urbanization to some extent, as is already the case in Bangladesh. In population dynamics and climate change, Balk sought to identify the urban populations most likely to be affected by extreme climatic events in each continent. They distinguished between low elevation coastal zones and arid regions or drylands. The result for Southeast Asia shows that the proportion of city dwellers living in arid zone is greater than that of the city dwellers living in a low elevation coastal zone. Even so, for cities with more than 1 million inhabitants, nearly a quarter of the population is potentially threatened by the sea level rise. Now, with this, we come to our second quiz. The question is, which city was most badly affected by the Hurricane Katrina? The options are number 1, Dakar, number 2, New Orleans, number 3, Bangladesh, number 4, Lagos. And the correct answer is New Orleans. With this, we come to our conclusion that the link between migration and environment will differ according to whether environmental changes take the form of extreme events or continuous transformations. One thing we can be sure of, however, is that the continuing rise in the world population over the coming decades will be reflected in ever greater population pressure, and an ever greater number of people will thus be exposed to the risk of extreme climatic conditions. This does not mean to say that the link between migration and environment is purely mechanical. For instance, a worsening of poverty does not always trigger a migration wave. Furthermore, the relationship between migration and environment overlaps with other relationships between food security and environment, urbanization and migration, and so forth. Migration, either short or long term, can also cause tension between displaced persons and the local population. Lastly, Migration can be regarded as an adjustment variable allowing populations to adapt to changes in their environment, whether these changes are extreme and sudden or more gradual and insidious. Thank you.